Welcome back to Occult Archives.
where we uncover the mysteries and myths and legends behind history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires to...
Secrets too dangerous to be read.
This is episode 277.
The Key to Theosophy, Unlocking the Forbidden Doctrine,
Esoteric Science.
and the Hidden Brotherhood of the Divine Wisdom.
Okay, so have you ever gotten this feeling that there's kind of like a hidden layer to reality? Like there's this like a deeper understanding that's just waiting to be unlocked.
I get that feeling from this book, The Key to Theosophy.
Right.
It promises a look at these ancient doctrines and esoteric sciences. And I know you're always up for finding a way to get informed quickly but thoroughly without like slogging through endless tomes. So what secrets does this key reveal?
Yeah, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be doing a deep dive into The Key to Theosophy by H.P. Blavatsky. And yeah, it's not like trying to be the entire library of esoteric knowledge, right? It's more like, as the title suggests, it's kind of an essential tool to kind of open the door to this much larger world of ideas.
It's like a map.
It's like a map,
To a much larger territory.
Exactly.
That you can then explore at your own pace.
Right.
In more detail.
And so what we want to do today is we want to explore the core principles of Theosophy as they are presented in this book and kind of illuminate those concepts which might seem a little out there at first glance.
And really try and grasp the essence of what Blavatsky's trying to convey. And I think it's worth noting, that this book is really consciously trying to bridge the gap between these very, very ancient ideas, this wisdom that's been passed down for centuries, and kind of the way that we in the West are used to thinking about things. So there's an element of simplification going on.
Yeah, she's trying to make it accessible.
She's trying to make it accessible. She does say, though, that the reader's still going to have to engage mentally.
Yeah, you can't totally phone it in.
And totally phone it in. It is a deep subject matter.
Yeah. And that's what I think, listeners to this show are interested in, is you want that real understanding, right? You're not looking for the Cliffs Notes. You're not looking for the superficial take, but you don't necessarily want to spend years and years, going down this rabbit hole. So we're going to try and find that happy medium for you.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to give you a real solid overview, but in a way that's going to be what's the word I'm looking for? Engaging and not too dry.
Right. We don't want to bore you to death with it. And hopefully, maybe this will spark your curiosity. Maybe this will be something that you decide that you want to explore on your own in more depth. But we want to provide you with the key, so to speak.
That's the key. Exactly.
All right. So let's jump in. And one of the first things that the book makes incredibly clear, and it's really foundational to everything else, is that Theosophy is not intended as a new religion.
It's not a religion at all.
It's not a religion at all.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they spend a lot of time in this book kind of dispelling misconceptions about Theosophy.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be very clear about that, because if you come to this expecting it to be another set of dogmas or beliefs that you have to sign up to, you're going to be very, very disappointed.
Yeah, and in fact they actually say, like, what is the creed of Theosophy? What is the ritual of Theosophy?
Yeah.
They say the creed is loyalty to truth.
Loyalty to truth.
And the ritual is to honor every truth by use.
That's it.
That's it. Like, so it's a very, very open framework. It's not prescriptive. It's not saying, you must do this, or you must believe this, or you must worship this particular thing, right? It's really about this pursuit of truth wherever that leads.
It's about freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's deliberately positioning itself as not belonging exclusively to any one religion or society or even a particular point in history. It's presented as something that is much more universal, right?
It's a birthright of every human soul.
Right, a birthright of every human soul. And this is another key principle here that is emphasized over and over again, which is this idea of universal brotherhood.
Yeah. And it's interesting because she immediately kind of tackles a a very common misconception
Right.
right at the beginning of the book, which is that this is some kind of offshoot of Buddhism, or it's somehow anti-Christian.
Hmm.
And she says, no, actually, both of those religions,
Yeah.
in their original teachings, actually emphasize this idea of universal brotherhood, this idea that we're all interconnected.
Right, right. So it's really trying to kind of find that common ground, find that underlying unity.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so now we come to this distinction, which is between exoteric and esoteric theosophy.
Right. And this is a really important distinction to understand. So exoteric theosophy, is basically the Theosophical Society itself.
Right. It's like the outer layer.
It's the outer layer.
Yeah.
It's the publicly available teachings. It's the organization, and within that, you've got people from all sorts of different, religious and philosophical backgrounds. You might have Christians, you might have, Buddhists, you might have Hindus, you might have people who don't subscribe to any particular religion at all.
Agnostics,
atheists, whatever.
Yeah.
But the unifying factor is that they are committed to at least one of the society's three main objects.
Yeah.
Which are promoting philanthropy,
Right.
studying ancient literatures, and exploring psychic phenomena.
Mm.
So those are the three main aims of the society.
So it's kind of like a cooperative, it's like a group of people who are interested in these areas, and they're coming together to learn and to share.
To collaborate.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the esoteric side of things is a little bit more esoteric, right? This is where we start to get into these deeper levels of knowledge that are supposedly passed down from these, what they call initiates or masters of esoteric wisdom.
Right. And this is where it starts to get a little bit more mysterious, and maybe even a little bit more controversial for some people. Because what they're saying is that there's this lineage of teachers who have maintained this knowledge over the centuries, and they've passed it down to their students in a very, very selective way.
Mm.
So it's not something that's publicly available. It's not something that you can just, read about in a book.
It's an oral tradition.
It's an oral tradition.
It's an initiation.
It's an initiation, yeah.
Yeah.
And the book is also quite critical, of the kind of the more mainstream spiritualist movements.
Oh, very much so.
That were around at the time.
Like spiritualism with a capital S.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They refer to it as transcendental materialism.
Right.
Which I think is a very interesting term.
Right.
Because it's saying that, even though these people are talking about, spirits and the afterlife and all these things, they're still approaching it from a very materialistic perspective.
Right. They're trying to scientifically prove it.
They're trying to scientifically prove it. They're trying to, get evidence, through seances and all these things. And Blavatsky is saying, that's not the right way to go about it.
Right. She cautions against dabbling in the occult without having the proper understanding. She's saying it can lead to all sorts of negative consequences if you do that.
Yeah, and this is where the idea of black magic comes in, which we'll probably talk about more in a later episode. But she's saying that if you don't know what you're doing, you can actually end up causing harm to yourself and to others.
Right.
So she's very much advocating for a more disciplined approach to the study of the occult.
Right. And so they prefer to focus on what they call the proven natural law.
Yeah.
Of the tradition of the sacred science.
So there's a real emphasis on tradition.
On lineage.
On knowledge that's been passed down and tested and proven over time.
Tried and true.
Tried and true.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think the aims of Theosophy, as presented in this book, are quite interesting. Because on the one hand, they're quite ambitious. They're talking about alleviating human suffering. They're talking about promoting universal brotherhood. They're talking about, really kind of raising the level of consciousness on the planet. But at the same time, they're also very, very grounded in a kind of an ethical framework.
It's not just about lofty ideals. It's about how do you actually live this in your daily life?
Right. How do you put it into practice? And that comes down to ethics, to morality. And the book actually makes it very clear that, the primary goal is to alleviate human suffering. But it goes on to say that moral suffering is actually more important than physical suffering.
Really?
So it's not just about, helping people who are physically ill or who are in poverty. It's also about helping people who are suffering mentally, emotionally, spiritually.
So it's about fostering ethical behavior.
Fostering ethical behavior, purifying the soul, becoming a better person.
Yeah. And the pursuit of this esoteric knowledge, that we were talking about earlier, it's not supposed to be for personal gain. It's not supposed to be just for intellectual stimulation. It's supposed to be for the benefit of all. It's supposed to be selfless.
Selfless study.
Selfless study. Yeah, very much so.
That's a key idea in Theosophy.
Right. Now, another aim of the society, and I think this is fascinating, is to collect and disseminate information on the world's religions, philosophies, and myths, and legends, and sciences.
Yeah, so they're
Yeah.
they're really interested in in gathering knowledge from all the different traditions and seeing what they have in common.
You finding those common threads, those universal truths that run through all of them.
Exactly. And also to develop the spiritual and psychic powers
Mhm.
that they believe are latent in all of us. So they're not just interested in the intellectual side of things. They're also interested in the practical side of developing our spiritual potential.
Right, right. So let's talk about this interconnectedness, this idea of the interconnectedness of all humanity, because I think this is such a powerful, powerful concept.
It is. And they use a really nice analogy to illustrate this, which is the analogy of a plant with a root and a stem and leaves.
Right.
And they're saying that, humanity is like that stem that's growing from a shared spiritual root. And if you harm one part of the plant, if you harm one leaf or one branch, you're ultimately harming the whole organism.
Yeah. So harming another person is not just an isolated event.
Right.
It's creating a ripple effect that's gonna impact everyone.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of karmic laws comes in, which we'll talk about more in a later episode. But basically what they're saying is that there are these unseen principles of cause and effect that are operating all the time.
Okay.
And our actions are not just affecting us, they're affecting everyone around us.
Yeah.
And the consequences of those actions can ripple out across lifetimes.
Wow. Okay, so now let's get into this distinction between personality and individuality, or what they call the ego.
Okay, so the ego that we're familiar with, the I that we think of as ourselves, the Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones, that's really just a collection of experiences.
A bundle of memories.
A bundle of memories, a bundle of habits, of tendencies.
It's that sense of self that we have
That's right.
that is based on our memories and our experiences.
Exactly. And it's constantly changing. It's evolving. It's being shaped by the experiences that we have. But that's not the true self. That's not the real ego. The real ego is something that's much more permanent. It's something that persists across lifetimes.
Okay, so how do they distinguish between those two?
So they call the personality that we're familiar with, they call that the false personality.
A false personality. Okay.
And they call the real ego, the true individuality, they call that the reincarnating ego.
Okay.
And the way they describe it is they say that the reincarnating ego is like an actor on a stage.
I like that.
So the actor is the real self.
Right.
And the different roles that the actor plays, they might play, Macbeth one day and Hamlet the next day and, King Lear the day after that, all these different characters, but it's the same actor underneath.
Right. So the true ego, the individuality, that's the actor, and then the personality, the temporary self, that's the role that they're playing in this particular lifetime.
Exactly. And this reincarnating ego, this true individuality, that's what persists after death.
Okay.
And it's not what returns to earth as a spirit in the way that, the spiritualists talk about.
Right.
It's something much more than that.
Okay, and so after death, what happens to that true individuality?
Well, it goes to a place called Devachan.
Devachan, okay.
Which is a state of bliss, a state of rest.
Okay.
And it's not a permanent state. It's a kind of a period of assimilation of the experiences of the last lifetime.
Yeah.
And then eventually the ego is reborn into a new body, and the cycle begins again.
Now, the book also talks about why Theosophy, why it gained so much interest when it first emerged, but also why it faced a fair amount of opposition.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there were a few reasons for this.
Yeah.
Firstly, I think there was a growing dissatisfaction with materialism,
Right.
the kind of the purely materialistic scientific worldview
Yeah.
that was becoming very, very dominant.
Well, this is like the late 19th century.
Late 19th century.
So science is really, really starting to take off.
Exactly. And a lot of people were feeling that this was leaving something out, that it wasn't explaining the whole of human experience.
Right, that there's more to life than just matter.
Exactly. And then at the same time, there's also a lot of dissatisfaction with traditional Christian theology.
Right.
A lot of people were starting to question, the dogmas of the church.
Yeah, they were finding them to be contradictory or not in line with their own experiences.
Exactly. And there was also this increasing fragmentation of religious institutions.
Right.
All these different sects and denominations springing up, all claiming to have the one true faith.
And that led to a lot of confusion and a lot of doubt.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so people were really looking for something new, something that would make sense to them, something that would speak to their own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Theosophy came along at just the right time to offer that to people.
Right. And I think also this idea that it could potentially reconcile science and spirituality was very appealing to a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's get into this concept of the 7 principles of man, because this is where we start to really delve into the theosophical understanding of human nature.
Okay, so the idea here is that human beings are not just physical creatures, but we're also spiritual creatures.
Yeah.
And we have these different aspects to our being. And the way they describe it is that there are 7 principles or 7 aspects to the human constitution.
Okay, so seven different layers to our being.
7 different layers, yeah.
Yeah.
And they acknowledge that, the specific way that these principles are enumerated might vary in different Eastern philosophical schools.
Okay.
But the basic ideas are pretty much the same.
So it's the same general concept.
Yeah. And they use the familiar Christian concept of body, soul, and spirit as kind of a starting point.
Okay.
To try and make it more understandable to Westerners.
Okay.
But they say that it's more nuanced than that.
Okay, so let's break down these 7 principles. So what is the first one?
Okay, so the first principle is called Atma,
Atma.
which is the Sanskrit word for spirit.
Okay, and how do they describe that?
And they say that Atma is the universal divine essence.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that's individual to any one person. It's like the sunlight.
Mm.
It's everywhere. But you can't say that any one particular object owns the sunlight.
Right.
But the sunlight shines on everything.
Right. It permeates everything.
Exactly.
Okay, so Atma is like this universal divine spark that is in everything.
Exactly.
Okay, so what is the second principle?
The second principle is called Buddhi,
Buddhi.
which is the Sanskrit word for spiritual soul.
Yeah.
And Buddhi is basically the vehicle for Atma.
Okay, so the divine spark is kind of channeled through Buddhi.
Exactly. And Buddhi is impersonal.
Okay.
It doesn't have any attributes
Okay.
on this plane of existence.
All right.
It's pure potential.
All right.
Yeah.
So what is the third principle?
The third principle is called Manas,
Manas.
which is a Sanskrit word for mind.
Okay.
And this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated because Manas is dual.
Okay.
So there's a higher Manas and a lower Manas.
Okay. So we have the higher mind and the lower mind.
Exactly. And the higher Manas is the part of us that aspires to the spiritual.
Okay.
It's the part of us that wants to connect with Buddhi, that wants to connect with Atma.
Okay.
The lower Manas is the part of us that's more animalistic.
Okay.
It's the part of us that's driven by desires, by passions,
Okay.
by, the need for gratification.
So it's our base instincts.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the spiritual ego is actually the combination of Atma, Buddhi, and Manas.
Okay.
So those 3 principles together
Mhm.
make up what they call the spiritual ego.
Okay.
And that's the part of us that reincarnates.
Right. Right. That's what carries over from lifetime to lifetime.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that it's not Atma that reincarnates
Okay.
or even Atma Buddhi.
Okay.
It's Atma Buddhi Manas.
So it's that combination of those 3 principles.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does reincarnation work then? How does that process unfold?
So basically what they're saying is that after death, the spiritual ego goes to Devachan, which we talked about earlier. And then eventually it's drawn back to Earth
Okay.
by its karma.
Okay, so karma is playing a role here.
Karma is playing a huge role.
Okay.
And it's reborn into a new body.
Yeah.
And the circumstances of that new life are determined by the karma that it's accumulated in previous lifetimes.
So it's not just a random process.
It's not random at all. It's very, very precise.
It's very specific.
It's very specific.
Okay. So the things that we do in this life have an impact on our future lives.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And not just in kind of a vague, general way.
Okay.
But in a very, very specific way. So the actions that we take, the thoughts that we think, the feelings that we have, all of these things are creating karma.
Okay, so it's not just our actions, it's also our thoughts and our feelings.
Everything.
Everything. Wow. Okay, and that karma is shaping our future lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about these skandhas.
Okay, so the skandhas are basically the components of the personality. So, we talked earlier about how the personality is like the role that the actor is playing.
Right.
The skandhas are like the props and the costumes and the the lines that the actor is using.
Okay, so it's the material that they're working with.
Exactly.
In that particular role.
Exactly. And after death, the material skandhas, the ones that are made of matter, those are dissolved.
Okay.
But they leave behind karmic effects.
Okay.
So it's like, you use a prop in a play and then you discard it.
Right.
But it leaves behind a trace.
Right, there's an imprint.
There's an imprint.
Okay.
And that imprint can then affect your future lives.
Wow. Okay.
So it's like, if you play a villain in a play and you use a sword to kill somebody, that sword is going to be discarded after the play is over.
Right.
But the karmic effect of that killing is going to stay with you. And it might manifest in your next life as, you being born into a family where there's a lot of violence, or you might have a tendency towards anger or aggression.
Okay, so these skandhas, they kind of leave behind these karmic seeds, if you will.
Exactly.
That then sprout in our future lives.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about Devachan? We've talked about it a little bit. What exactly is it?
Okay, so Devachan is basically a state of mental bliss.
Okay.
It's a state of happiness. It's a state of peace.
Okay.
And it's a continuation of the best parts of the last life.
Okay.
So it's not like heaven in the Christian sense, where you're judged and you're either sent to heaven or hell.
Right.
It's more like a dream state where you're reliving the happiest moments of your life.
Okay.
And you're kind of basking in the good karma that you've accumulated.
It's like a reward.
It's like a reward.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now, what about nirvana?
Okay, so nirvana is a state beyond Devachan.
Okay.
And it's very difficult to describe in words.
Right.
But it's basically a state of complete liberation.
Okay.
It's a state of freedom from all suffering, from all desire, from all attachment.
Okay, so it's like total enlightenment.
Total enlightenment.
Okay.
Exactly.
And how do you achieve nirvana?
Well, it's a very, very long process.
Okay.
And it involves, many lifetimes of spiritual development.
Okay.
But the basic idea is that you have to transcend the illusion of the separate self.
Okay.
You have to realize that you are one with the divine.
Okay, so it's about kind of merging with the ultimate reality.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what about these nirmanakayas?
Okay, so nirmanakayas are beings who have achieved nirvana,
Okay.
but they have chosen to remain in the earthly sphere
Okay.
out of compassion for humanity.
Okay.
So they're basically like bodhisattvas. They're beings who have reached enlightenment, but they have chosen to stay behind and help others achieve enlightenment.
So they're like spiritual guides.
Exactly.
Okay. And how do they help us?
Well, they can't interfere directly with our karma.
Okay.
Because